that introduction. And thank you very much to the Dutch Consulate, Sebastian, and the other sponsors who have made today possible. I'm very, very excited to be here. So resilience is a word that is increasingly being used in a number of different professions. It is often misused, in my opinion. It's commonly associated by many practitioners as being particularly relevant to climate. Others would put it firmly in the thematic area of disaster management. But really, resilience has application all around a society. And so trying to come to some kind of collective understanding of resilience is in all of our best interests because of the opportunity for it to be misused. We've had many other words which might have become buzzwords that have lost meaning over time, what I would call weasel words, words that their true meaning has been sucked out of the middle of them because of the use or misuse of them over long periods of time. The definition, and the working definition that I use, is that urban resilience is the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So really it is about complexity, and there's a role for every level in a city in building resilience, right from the ordinary Capetonian, in the case of our city, right to communities or households or institutions or different spheres of government. So what are acute shocks and chronic stresses? We hear about this regularly when people talk about resilience. So our chronic stresses commonly weaken the fabric of our society. They can include things like unemployment or food insecurity or racism. They exist with us. Of course, we may aim, and we do, to try and eliminate those kinds of stresses, but they are with us for the here and now. And then we have acute shocks, which are typically short, sharp events. They may have a beginning and an end. So drought, for example, or a cyber attack, or a terrorist attack for that matter. And resilience really is about the intersection between shocks and stresses and the multiplication of the impacts of shocks because of the stresses that underlie. So in responding to resilience or building resilience, we need to look at both of these two phenomena and operate from where we are now. I'm tasked as the lead of 100 Resilient Cities in Cape Town, which is a program started in 2013 by the Rockefeller Foundation to lead the drafting of the first city resilience strategy. We obviously have a unique opportunity with our minds having been on the very, very severe drought to be able to take some of the lessons learned from that drought and to put them more generally into responses to no matter what shocks we may face in the future. And I don't think it's entirely important that we have to build responses to every particular shock. We do have some prioritized stresses and shocks, which I'll indicate in a moment, but many of the responses to resilience, the way we hotwire it into our systems or empower stakeholders or build capabilities, are equally useful for no matter what shocks we may experience, whether known or unknown in the future. So this is a very, very good opportunity and an opportune one at the moment. Just for the record, Cape Town joins about 9 other African cities in this particular network. We're a Wave 3 city, so we were the last of the cities to join and become part of 100 Resilient Cities. But other cities in Africa which are part of this include Durban, Addis Ababa, Luxor, Kigali, Dakar, Painesville, and Lagos. Okay, well, apologies. I may continue without my slides until they catch up. So one of the as with resilience and many practitioners, it's common to use a particular framework of analysis. And that analysis obviously adds and is meant to include a bunch of complexity. But let me start with, before I go into that, some understanding of what resilience may be and what it may not be. So I don't personally believe that resilience is necessarily an appropriate end goal for a society or a city. I think there are many other goals which are important for us to aspire to. The maximization of employment, for example, the eradication of poverty, overcoming the spatial legacies of apartheid, which was mentioned in the previous presentation. Those are important, large transformational goals for South Africa, for many urban environments, and indeed for Cape Town. I think resilience is more of a process, one that we continually go through, we reflect after particular events, and we get better. It's important to build resilience and the adaptive nature of resilience into those large transformational goals and the strategies and plans that may go with them. Because it's not like these plans and strategies are necessarily linear in nature. We begin here and then we end here. A number of things can go wrong in the delivery of those particular responses. And hence, I think resilience is more of a process than an end goal. I think it's also important to consider that resilience, certainly in the case of developing cities and Africa, has to be more than simply coping. And it's one of the most severe critiques of resilience, is it just about making people cope where they are so that more wrongs can be brought upon them? So if you look at, for example, informal settlements, which are pervasive in Africa and in growing extensively in the city of Cape Town, as of now, pretty much 50% of all new home builds in Cape Town are in informal sectors, in informal settlements in Cape Town. We, of course, have to aim as a city and as a society for a lot more than many of the problems that people encounter in informal settlements. So whether that be pathways to formality or the like. But we do have an issue here and now, and that means we have to be able to improve informal settlements where they are through whatever measures. So that often is where people would say a criticism of resilience is it's merely about coping. And that's why it links to my previous point, we have to have higher transformational goals as a city. And we need to deal constantly with the root causes of why we need to build a resilient city in the first place. The things like inequality or poverty or those spatial legacies of apartheid. My last point here, which I think about quite often, is that resilience in my mind cannot really be objectively measured. It can only really be tested after an event. And even then, that assessment would be very qualitative in nature. So in this way, it's quite different from something like sustainability, which can have measures and extensive indicators attached to it, as problematic as they are. So when people say we are resilient, it is far more of a subjective claim, and I think it's important for us to use it where we think appropriate, but it is a very, very difficult thing to measure. Notwithstanding my previous comment, it's useful to try and get some insights into where a city may be in terms of its relative strengths and vulnerabilities when it comes to resilience. A framework that I use in the work that I lead is the City Resilience Framework, and I apologize for the small writing on the slide, but it revolves around 4 dimensions, being leadership and strategy, health and well-being, economy and society, and infrastructure and environment, and then is divided up into a number of drivers and sub-drivers, in total about 156 sub-drivers, which can give an indication of where, if one wants to try and influence resilience, certainly at a citywide level, where relative effort should be placed. At the beginning of last year, in the project that I lead, we started the process with a significant amount of engagement across Cape Town in order to ask Cape Townians what they thought the most relevant shocks and stresses were, as well as to engage with a number of thematic specialists about where they thought the relevant challenges and strengths are in the great system that makes up the resilience or lack thereof in Cape Town. So we engaged with about 11,000 people face-to-face in informal settlements and backyards in Cape Town, and we did that very deliberately to be able to chat with those Cape Townians who arguably live in the most vulnerable circumstances. And we held a number of focus groups and one-on-one interviews, which allowed us to connect with about 140 thematic specialists. And then we did 2 community conversations as well to get a different lens of analysis for this particular work, which would bring something more spatial to the table. And the prioritized shocks, and of course, this can never really be a definitive list, and it can change from month to month or year to year, include those shocks on the screen at the moment, which came up most prominently in our engagement with people living in informal settlements, which was also confirmed by the various thematic specialists we engaged. Many of them will not look particularly surprising to you, but we pulled through some ones that maybe we don't commonly think about, including financial economic crises, an acknowledgement that Cape Town is linked into a much larger economy, a national economy, a global economy. It links to things like dollar strength, the flight of capital from South Africa, which happened extensively as recently as last May, Trump's trade wars with China, policy uncertainty at a national level. Whatever our views of those things, they do bear down on Cape Town and have an effect on, for example, employment in our own city. And shocks with regards to financial crises, something like the 2008 crisis, could certainly emerge in a place like Cape Town. And one thinks particularly of the difficult situation that Eskom finds it now in. It is something that we need to be aware of and prepare for. Infrastructure failure is another one that was commonly pulled through as a catch-all for a number of different types of failures, but what dominantly came through there was the systemic failures around Metro Rail, and certainly at the time of doing this work last year, the Central Line in Cape Town had been shut for 6 weeks, significantly increasing the burden on our roads at the time. With regards to our prioritized stresses, this came through as well in the same work. We decided very consciously from extensive engagement to pull through trauma in society as a prioritized stress. We were one of only 2 cities in this network of 100 cities around the world which have decided to do this. The other one happens to be Boston in the United States. So here, people who engaged with us spoke extensively about intergenerational trauma, the continued traumatic effects of apartheid, colonialism, the spatial legacies of our city, exposure to crime and violence, particularly gender-based violence, but not just exposure to what might have happened, even just the anticipation of what might happen to someone in the future. Climate change is there as a stress because its impacts appear on the previous screen under prioritized shocks. It is pervasive, it is growing, and it is with us. It certainly has arrived. Others you can see on the screen: traffic congestion, which was mentioned earlier today, inadequate public transport systems, and food security came through quite strongly, as well as an area which needs considerably more work done in the city because of the growing amount of food deserts in the city. People unable to access affordable and nutritious food simply because they may be far away from it. The next two slides are the results of a comprehensive data project which we undertook using the framework from a couple of slides ago. We did a quantitative output using 120 quantitative data points, and then we did a qualitative output using 156 qualitative data points from engagement with thematic specialists. This is the quantitative output which we have on the screen at the moment. It shows relative strengths and relative weaknesses for resilience in Cape Town. The glaring red dot at approximately 1 o'clock, if you were to pretend that that was a clock, falls under a driver called livelihoods and employment. And that red dot speaks very much to the high degree of unemployment in our city, which is at approximately 19% at the moment on the narrow definition. But that percentage obviously betrays the real hard numbers behind that figure, which is approximately 400,000 people in Cape Town who want to work, but for whatever reason cannot or do not work. And that is really a key resilience challenge in Cape Town, because in moments of crises and shock, and I think this pulled through a little bit towards the end of the previous presentation as well, it's ultimately the strengths of our people and our households and our communities which really determine the extent of our response to shock events. And households or communities with less means and less financial means are hamstrung in those times of shock. And so this is the single standout problem with regards to the resilience of our people in Cape Town. But along the side there, as you hit 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, if you were to pretend that was the face of a watch, other areas which are particularly weak in Cape Town refer to collective identity and community support, those notions of who are we and social cohesion, as well as security and the rule of law, looking at both crime and our criminal justice system, and then more generally, the enabling environment, which doesn't just relate to what we have in Cape Town, but of course the broader things that bear down on us as well, like national policy and legislation. On some of the left side, according to the quantitative side, there are some more relative strengths. But here, of course, and I'm very open to critique of this methodology myself, because it is methodology that is primarily, although it's been used all around the world, I think it does here betray its particular leanings to formality. And so one of the sub-projects I'm working on at the moment with Slum Dwellers International and Cork in Cape Town is to improve the number of variables and indicators around informality, with a clear desire to make sure that in informality, we don't simply look at it as a stress, but we look at it as a significant asset in terms of resilience as well. To be able to capture more acutely, and you will notice here, which everyone will certainly comment on, is that the mobility one seems very abnormally strong. And this is principally because here, the interconnections between formality and informality, I admit, are not very, very accurately measured. But informality offers us significant strength over here, for example, when our rail system fails or when particular bus companies may go on strike. So a methodology, not without criticism, but at least we know enough to be trying to do something about it, and we will be improving it with Slum Dwellers International over the course of the next few months. This is the qualitative output developed by about 140 specialists from various universities in Cape Town, business and community organizations, along with some government officials. And here are the particular issues which have been highlighted as areas of particular vulnerability are once again collective identity and community support, that dimension which deals with crime, and then empowered stakeholders as well, which links very, very well as well to the previous presentation because it has to do with participation, the extent to which it is real. It also has it also deals with the extent to which people feel empowered with information that is useful to them in order to protect them when times get particularly tough under a shock event. So there are some strengths there as well, but if there's some areas which, according to the analysis that we worked on last year, are particular areas of vulnerability, they would be around jobs, would be around empowered stakeholders, security and the rule of law, and then lack of collective identity and community support. So I've got on here a draft, which are 5 pillars which I've been thinking through as sort of guiding pillars for the resilience strategy work in Cape Town. The first one, compassionate, holistically healthy city, intends to cover those kind of actions which commonly deal with youth empowerment, mental health issues and access to and support there as well. Capable job-creating city looks very, very much at the risks to our environment around resource constraints such as water and energy and carbon, but also attempts to come up with actions, particularly around the informal economy, which is underappreciated in our city and is a pathway for those who desire to formality, but is also a place where people may land when they fall out of formality. Connected climate adaptive city is that pillar which deals particularly around placemaking, the notions of livable waterways, which was raised in a question before, as well as various issues related to informality in our mobility system, trying to look beyond simple engineering solutions to congestion. Collectively shock-ready city is trying to build those kinds of systems and community tools which can be overlaid on existing societal structures like neighborhood watches, safety forums, and environmental NGOs, any NGO for that matter. There isn't really any desire or necessarily resources to start a whole bunch of new things, but there is a lot of opportunity through empowerment to increase those. So some lessons from the drought which heavily impacted this work and which I bring to the fore today, and many of these have also been raised by Gina, who is the speaker after me. These are, I think, valuable for any shock event, and are lessons which I think we should be loath to lose if indeed the drought is over. And those include invest in partnerships beyond the city, and I have a big C there for the city government, because at times the city government tried to do far too much by itself. Share information to build public trust. Indeed, during the drought, much public trust was lost until information was more readily and honestly shared. Increase redundancies in the system speaks very obviously to the fact that systems shouldn't overly rely on one particular source, and in terms of the drought, it was very much our dam system. Embrace the realities of climate risk, and so in this particular drought, the first 2 years of the drought were more commonly associated with many of the droughts that had come before, but the 3rd year of that drought, which was particularly the kicker, through the system to beyond the limits of which it was created to operate, and then strengthen adaptive leadership capabilities. Those of us who are leaders in our organizations and in government, the ability to understand when a system is in stress, and the ability to understand that something, just because something has worked before, does not necessarily mean that model will work in the future. And I do think some of that came through in the drought as well. And so I've aligned some of those lessons with the pillars, in the draft pillars, which I'm trying to work around in the strategy, around compassionate, holistically healthy city, drawing attention to the multitude of actions that were conducted by ordinary Cape Townians, who are the real saviors of Cape Town during the drought, as well as other organizations like business and, of course, all spheres of government. But I've also attempted, perhaps rather crudely, to map relevant stresses against the drought, which were both magnifiers of the drought in terms of how some of us may have experienced it, and which would have been accentuated itself by the drought. So, for example, trauma or poverty, the ability to have the resources to be able to appropriately respond. I'm going to skip through this over now, but here, the idea with the strategy is that besides the 5 pillars, there are approximately 60 draft actions built into the strategy, many around trying to enable resilience through large parts of the city. There is also a fair amount of demonstrative actions, which links quite a lot to this idea, Amira, of being able to try things and fail if necessary, but learn from them. And there are a number of flagship actions as well. And I include a couple there on the screen, which have come through quite strongly from the people that we have engaged with. Mental health awareness, resilient placemaking, informal economy, manufacturing spaces, to be able to enable a lot more than simply trading in the informal economy. Tools for people to do the work they own. There should be no necessarily ownership of tools by government. Reflective learning, and we have a great initiative coming up, which we're launching at the end of March, which is a digital drought library, which is done in partnership with ACDI at UCT, as well as adaptive leadership. And that picture over there is from some methodology that we've developed with the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership about how to get large numbers of people to consider what it's like to operate in systems in stress and to learn from that. So key questions, and this is the second last slide, is how can we become a permanent shock-ready city? And that would be a case of trying to pivot off some of the learnings from the drought. I don't want to stretch that point too far, because one of the unique parts of the drought response was that certainly for the majority of Cape Town, and I'm not talking exclusively, many people came together and NGOs might have as well, but it was quite a unique shock because the majority of Cape Townians were able to respond to the shock from within their own homes. There are a lot of other shock events that could play out in Cape Town which would more tangibly require Cape Townians to come together, to overcome those notions of a lack of social cohesion. But it's a key question we need to consider. The far more difficult one, and the first one is hard enough, I agree, is if we are able to respond as a city to shock events, these acute events that hit us every so often, and I accept as well for many Cape Townians, shock events are far more of a lived reality than, for example, because of the spatial nature of them. But how can we be better as a city at responding to continuous stresses? And this question came up very specifically out of the community conversation that was hosted in Hout Bay. It was reflective of the activists who were there, thinking about the large Imizamo Yetu fire and the large societal response to the shock, but not necessarily to the underlying stresses that exist in that community on an ongoing basis. The answers here are a lot harder to find. Lastly, how can one get involved in this work? So we started with extensive public consultation at the beginning of the project, but we're going to obviously end with it as well. And so in May and June, there will be extensive public consultation, which I intend and commit to be real and authentic. And I'd be very happy to be hosted by various organizations who may want to go deep into this work and try and influence even further. And then in the strategy, which relies very heavily on ordinary Cape Townians, there are certain pledges, and draft pledges, and I include here some possible action steps that anyone could take, whether in their own home or in their own organization. And they include investigate and understand how shocks and stresses create citywide and local place-based risks for your organization. Engage with people in the city who are most impacted by your decisions. Clarify your role in building Cape Town's resilience. Engage in training and capacity building across your organization. Develop an action plan for your organization and adopt directions for resilience. And lastly, undertake action and investment from where you stand. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gareth. I do hope you've taken note of those dates and you're going to be flooding Gareth with requests for him to come to your organization or your communities to engage on this detail. It is generally available on some interweb website somewhere.
It's still in draft. It will be released a week before that consultation.
A week before that consultation. All right.
Yeah.
I won't take any comments or questions for you, I'm afraid. Gareth Morgan, everyone, from the City of Cape Town.